Tonight, we step into a mystery carved in jade, painted on pottery, and whispered through 7,000 years of memory. This is not a story about fantasy. This is about something the ancient Chinese saw, touched, feared, and worshipped. Something so real to them that they carved its image into their most precious objects, inscribed its name into oracle bones, used to speak with ancestors, and wove its presence into the fabric of their civilization. They called it Long, the dragon. And here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night. What if they weren't imagining it? What if the dragon wasn't mythology at all, but memory? Memory of something that once lived, breathed, and walked the earth alongside humans before vanishing into extinction and legend. Tonight, we ask a question that sounds impossible, but refuses to go away. Were dragons real? The oldest dragon anyone has ever found isn't written in a book or painted on a wall. It's carved from jade, polished smooth by hands, that lived 6,700 years ago. The Hongshan culture, a Neolithic society that flourished in what is now northeast China, left behind artifacts that puzzle every archaeologist who studies them. Among the most striking are the jade dragons, not crude attempts at mythical beasts, not abstract symbols, but detailed, deliberate carvings of creatures with serpentine bodies, horse-like heads, and features so specific they look like they were carved from life. These aren't sketches. They're portraits. The dragons are small, meant to be worn or carried, but the craftsmanship is extraordinary. The jade is hard, requiring hours of patient grinding with primitive tools. The curves are smooth, the proportions consistent across multiple examples. And here's the unsettling part. The Hongshan culture had no writing, no recorded mythology, no way to pass down elaborate fictional creatures through text. So how did scattered communities, separated by miles of wilderness, all carve the same dragon? With the same body shape, the same head, the same coiled posture. If this was pure imagination, why is it so consistent? Why does it look like something real? The dragons were found in elite tombs and temple sites, buried with the dead, placed in positions of honor. Whatever these creatures represented, they were important. Sacred, maybe. But more than that, they were familiar. The carvers knew what they were making. There's no hesitation in the craftsmanship, no sense of experimentation. These are confident representations of something the culture understood deeply. Some archaeologists argue the dragons were totems, spiritual symbols representing power or ancestry. Others suggest they were guardians, protective spirits meant to accompany the dead into the afterlife. But there's a third possibility, one that's harder to accept but impossible to ignore. What if the Hongshan people carved dragons because they'd seen them? Not as gods or spirits, but as animals. Rare, perhaps. Dangerous, certainly, but real. Living creatures that inhabited the forests, rivers, or mountains of ancient China. And if that's true, if these jade carvings are records rather than inventions, then we have to ask the next question. What happened to them? Where did the dragons go? Fast forward 2,000 years. The Shang Dynasty, around 1,200 BCE, has developed writing. Not for literature or history, but for divination. Oracle bones, pieces of turtle shell or ox scapula, were heated until they cracked, and the cracks were interpreted as messages from ancestors. The questions and answers were then inscribed on the bones in early Chinese characters. Thousands of these bones survive, and among the inscriptions are references to Long, dragons. But here's what makes scholars uncomfortable. The references aren't mythological, they're observational. Matter of fact, almost mundane. One inscription describes a dragon appearing in a field. Another mentions a dragon being killed and butchered. A third records a dragon captured alive and brought to the capital. These aren't prayers or legends. They're reports. The language is the same used to describe cattle, horses, or wildlife. Size is noted. Color is described. Behavior is recorded. The Shang scribes wrote about dragons the way a modern naturalist might write about discovering an unusual animal. With curiosity, yes, but also with the assumption that the reader knows what a dragon is. That it's a real thing requiring no explanation. Now, skeptics argue this is just linguistic confusion. That Long might have referred to some other animal, a crocodile or large snake, and was later mythologized into the dragon we know today. But the descriptions don't quite fit. The oracle bones mention features, limbs and scales, and behaviors that don't match any known animal in the region, and they're too consistent across decades of inscriptions to be mistakes or exaggerations. The Shang Dynasty lasted over 500 years. Multiple generations of scribes, working in different locations, all writing about the same creature in the same matter-of-fact way. Either they were all perpetuating an elaborate shared delusion, or they were recording observations of something real. Something that, by the time writing became common, was already rare enough to be noteworthy but familiar enough to need no explanation. Look up at the night sky in ancient China, and you'd see the heavens divided into sections, each governed by a celestial creature: the azure dragon of the east, the white tiger of the west, the black tortoise of the north, the vermilion bird of the south. These weren't just constellations. They were cosmic guardians, symbols of natural order, and the azure dragon was the most important. It stretched across the eastern sky, a chain of stars forming a serpentine body. Chinese astronomers mapped it with precision, noting its movements through the seasons, using it to track time and predict celestial events. But here's the question: why a dragon? Other cultures saw the same stars and imagined different shapes: bears, warriors, abstract patterns. So why did the ancient Chinese, looking at those specific stars, see a dragon? One possibility is that the constellation was named after the creature, not the other way around, that the azure dragon in the sky was a reference to something on the ground. A way of saying, this part of the heavens is governed by the same force that governs the rivers and storms below. Think about it. Most ancient cultures encoded their environment into their mythology. The Greeks put their gods on mountains because mountains dominated their landscape. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile because the river was life itself. If the Chinese put a dragon in the sky, maybe it's because dragons were part of their lived reality, not fantasy, not abstraction. But something they knew. Something powerful and awe-inspiring enough to deserve a place among the stars. And when you consider that the azure dragon was specifically associated with water, with rain and rivers and the life-giving spring floods, the connection becomes even stronger. Because every description of dragons in Chinese history, every myth and legend and oracle bone inscription, ties them to water. They live in rivers. They emerge after storms. They control rainfall. If you're going to invent a mythical creature, you can make it anything. But if you're recording an actual animal, you're constrained by what you've observed. And what the ancient Chinese observed, consistently, across thousands of years, was something that lived in or near water, and was powerful enough to reshape the natural world around it. So let's get practical. If dragons were real, what were they? Giant pythons? They're serpentine and water-dwelling, but they have no limbs. Chinese dragons have 4 legs. Crocodiles? They have the limbs and scales, but they're stiff, armored, built for ambush. Dragons are described as flexible, coiling, serpentine. Monitor lizards? Too small, wrong habitat. Giant sturgeon? Massive and whiskered, yes, but purely aquatic, no legs, no connection to land or sky. Here's the problem. The dragon is aquatic like the crocodile, but flexible like the python. It has limbs but moves like a serpent. It's tied to water but also appears on land. No modern animal has that combination. Not one. Which means if dragons were real, we're not looking for something alive today. We're looking at the fossil record, at species that went extinct before modern science could catalog them. Something large, semi-aquatic, serpentine but limbed. Something that lived in China's rivers and lakes thousands of years ago, and then vanished, leaving only bones, stories, and jade carvings behind. The answer isn't in the present. It's buried in the past. Here's where it gets strange. For thousands of years, Chinese farmers have been finding bones. Huge bones. Petrified. Ancient. Buried in hillsides and riverbeds. They didn't know what they were. Paleontology didn't exist yet. The concept of extinction, of creatures that once lived but vanished millions of years ago, wasn't part of human understanding. So, they looked at these enormous fossilized bones and came to the only conclusion that made sense: dragon bones. And they treated them accordingly, ground them into powder for traditional medicine, sold them to apothecaries who advertised them as powerful remedies. Entire pharmacies in cities like Henan specialized in dragon bone powder, sourcing fossils from rural areas where farmers discovered them while plowing fields. It wasn't until the early 20th century that Western paleontologists realized what was happening. Those dragon bones were dinosaur fossils, millions of years old, preserved in sediment and stone. China, it turns out, is one of the richest fossil beds in the world. The Sichuan Basin, the Gobi Desert, the Gansu Province. Layer upon layer of prehistoric life, buried and waiting. And for millennia, people had been finding them, interpreting them through the only framework they had: dragons. Now, here's the question. If ancient Chinese people regularly encountered dinosaur fossils, massive skeletons with long tails, sharp teeth, and clawed limbs, wouldn't that shape their understanding of what dragons looked like? Wouldn't it make the dragon myth more concrete, more detailed, more consistent? Think about it. You're a farmer in ancient China. You're digging a well, and you hit something hard. You excavate carefully and find bones, huge bones, a skull with teeth like daggers, a spine longer than your house. limbs ending in claws. You don't know about dinosaurs. You don't know about millions of years. But you know your culture has stories about dragons. And now, holding these bones, those stories suddenly make sense. Of course dragons existed. Here's the proof. This isn't speculation. We know people found fossils. We know they called them dragon bones. The question is how much those discoveries influenced the mythology. Did the myths come first, and the fossils simply confirm them? Or did the fossils come first, and the myths were attempts to explain what ancient people were finding in the ground? Either way, there's a connection, a tangible link between the creatures of legend and the physical evidence buried in the earth. And that connection suggests something important. The dragon isn't purely imaginary, it's rooted in something real. Whether that's living animals, extinct species, or fossilized remains, the dragon has always had one foot in reality. The question is which foot, and how deep? Chinese history is full of flood myths, stories of catastrophic deluges that reshape the land, destroy cities, and force survivors to start over. The most famous is the Great Flood, the one Yu the Great, supposedly tamed by dredging rivers and building channels. But floods appear in countless regional legends, and almost all of them mention dragons. Dragons stirring the waters, dragons blocking rivers, dragons emerging from the depths during storms. These aren't just background details. The dragons are central to the narrative. They're the cause, the force, the thing that makes the flood catastrophic, rather than just inconvenient. So what's really being described here? One possibility is that floods displaced animals. Massive storms and rising waters would force creatures out of their normal habitats. Snakes, crocodiles, large fish, anything living in or near the water would suddenly be visible, scrambling for higher ground or swept along by currents. To people experiencing the disaster, it would look like the rivers themselves were alive, filled with strange and terrifying creatures. Another possibility is that floods exposed fossils. Erosion during major flooding can strip away layers of sediment, revealing bones that had been buried for millennia. A farmer returning to his fields after a flood might find a dinosaur skeleton jutting from the mud. In the chaos of disaster, that discovery would seem connected to the flood itself. The dragon didn't just cause the flood revealed the dragon. There's also a more literal interpretation. Maybe some of these stories are exaggerated memories of real animal encounters during floods. A large python, displaced by rising water, swimming through a flooded village. A crocodile, aggressive and confused, attacking livestock or people in areas it wouldn't normally inhabit. These incidents would be traumatic, memorable, and over time, retold and embellished. The snake becomes longer. The crocodile becomes more monstrous. The story becomes a legend, and the creature at the center becomes a dragon. What's consistent across all these possibilities is that the dragon is tied to real events. Floods happened. Animals were displaced or exposed. People saw things that frightened them. And when they told the story later, when they tried to explain what they'd experienced, they used the word their culture had for something powerful, strange, and water-dwelling. Dragon. The line between myth and memory isn't as clear as we'd like to think. Especially when you're talking about events that happened thousands of years ago, passed down through oral tradition, shaped by fear and awe, and the very human need to make sense of the incomprehensible. Let's talk about what dragons actually look like in Chinese art and literature. Because here's the thing. They're weirdly specific. A Chinese dragon isn't a generic monster. It has consistent features, repeated across dynasties and regions. A long, serpentine body covered in scales. 4 legs with clawed feet. A head that's often described as resembling a horse or camel, with a long snout and flared nostrils. Antlers, usually branching like a deer's. Whiskers, long and trailing. Sometimes a mane or flowing hair along the spine. Occasionally, wings, though not always. And that combination is strange. Because if you're inventing a creature from scratch, why give it antlers and whiskers? Why make it look like a composite of real animals? The traditional explanation is that dragons are exactly that, composite creatures, built from pieces of other animals, each chosen for symbolic reasons. The scales of a fish for water, the claws of an eagle for power, the antlers of a deer for longevity, the whiskers of a catfish for sensitivity. But here's the problem with that explanation. It assumes ancient people were thinking symbolically, abstractly, like modern artists designing a fantasy creature. But we know from oracle bone inscriptions and early texts that dragons were treated as real, observable animals, not symbols, not abstractions, things you could see, hunt, capture. So maybe the anatomical accuracy isn't symbolic. Maybe it's literal. Maybe dragons had whiskers because they were aquatic, using them to sense movement in murky water, the way catfish do. Maybe they had antlers because they were territorial, using them to compete with rivals, the way deer do. Maybe the scales were real scales, protective armor that made them difficult to kill. Maybe the long body wasn't artistic exaggeration, but an accurate description of something genuinely serpentine, something built for swimming and navigating rivers. If you strip away the mythology and just look at the physical descriptions, you get something that sounds almost plausible: a large, elongated animal. Semi-aquatic, scaled and armored. Limbs adapted for both land and water. Sensory organs for navigating dark or murky environments. Head structure, suggesting a predator. Something that hunts. That's not a god. That's not a symbol. That's a biological organism. And if it is, if even half of the descriptions are based on observation rather than imagination, then we're not looking for a mythical creature. We're looking for an extinct species. Something that lived, thrived, and then vanished before anyone thought to draw it accurately or describe it in terms we'd recognize today. The dragon isn't impossible, it's just lost. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, is one of the foundational figures of Chinese civilization. Legendary, yes, but treated in historical texts as a real person who lived around 2700 BCE. He's credited with inventing writing, medicine, and government, a culture hero. And according to myth, when he died, he didn't stay dead. A dragon descended from the heavens. The Yellow Emperor climbed onto its back, and together, they ascended into the sky, disappearing into immortality. It's a beautiful story, symbolic, clearly. The kind of myth every culture creates to elevate its founders beyond mortality. But let's ask an uncomfortable question. What if it wasn't entirely metaphorical, not the ascending to heaven part? That's obviously mythological. But the dragon? What if there was a real creature involved? Something rare and impressive enough that its presence became central to the story. Think about how other cultures used animals and rituals in displays of power. Indian rulers rode elephants. Mongolian Khans rode horses so perfectly trained they seemed supernatural. Roman emperors paraded exotic animals, lions and bears, to demonstrate their reach and dominance. What if the Yellow Emperor, or rulers like him, had access to a rare animal that their culture called a dragon? Something large and imposing, kept as a symbol of authority, paraded during ceremonies. And here's what makes this possibility even more compelling. What if dragons weren't just powerful animals but intelligent ones? Not human-level intelligence, not language or culture, but something more than pure instinct. The kind of intelligence we see in dolphins, elephants, or crows. Problem-solving, memory, social structure. Chinese texts don't just describe dragons as animals, they describe them as beings, creatures capable of choice, of responding to human action, of behavior that suggests understanding. Some stories mention dragons that could be bargained with, others describe dragons that seem to recognize specific people. There are accounts of dragons learning, adapting, even showing what looks like gratitude or revenge. If dragons had that level of intelligence, they wouldn't just be impressive to capture. They'd be trainable, manageable, the kind of creature a ruler would desperately want to possess and display, not just for its size, but for its mind. War elephants weren't valued just for their strength, but for their ability to be trained, to follow commands in battle. If dragons possessed similar intelligence, if they could learn, remember, respond to handlers, then keeping one would be the ultimate demonstration of power. Not just dominance over nature, but partnership with something extraordinary. Over generations, the memory of that animal, that relationship, would blur with mythology. The creature becomes divine. The ruler's connection to it becomes spiritual rather than literal. But at the core, there might be a grain of truth. A real animal, intelligent and rare, now extinct, that was once valuable enough to be associated with the most powerful figures in early Chinese history. And when that creature went extinct, when no one alive had seen one in generations, the memory would shift. The animal becomes myth. The ruler's mastery over it becomes divine ascension. The dragon stops being biology and becomes theology. But the connection remains. Buried in the story, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. This would also explain why later dynasties adopted dragons so forcefully as imperial symbols. Not just because they were powerful, but because they represented a lost relationship. A time when rulers commanded creatures so intelligent, so rare, that their existence seemed to bridge the gap between earth and heaven. The dragon wasn't just a symbol of power. It was proof that power once meant something more than armies and gold. It meant understanding, partnership, connection to forces that couldn't be controlled through violence alone. And maybe, when the dragons died, that kind of power died with them. Every dragon in Chinese mythology is tied to water. Rivers, lakes, rain, storms, the ocean. This isn't coincidental, it's fundamental. Dragons live in water. They control water. They are water, in some essential way. So if dragons were real, this ecological connection matters, because it tells us where to look and what to look for. China's waterways have always been rich with life. The Yangtze River alone once supported hundreds of species, many of them large and unusual. giant paddlefish, growing to 23 feet, Chinese sturgeon, armored and ancient. Soft-shell turtles the size of car hoods, freshwater dolphins, alligators. And these are just the species we know about, the ones that survived long enough to be documented. How many others went extinct before modern science could catalog them? How many strange, rare, water-dwelling creatures lived in China's rivers and lakes during the Neolithic and Bronze Age, only to vanish as human populations expanded, habitats shrank, and ecosystems collapsed? There's a theory, not widely accepted but compelling, that dragons were the memory of an apex aquatic predator, something large enough to be dangerous, rare enough to be legendary, and tied so completely to water that when it disappeared, its absence was felt and remembered. Maybe it was a species of crocodilian, larger and more adaptable than the Chinese alligator. Maybe it was a kind of giant otter, or aquatic mammal, sleek and serpentine in the water. Maybe it was something even stranger, a relic species that survived the Pleistocene in isolated pockets of China's river systems, clinging to existence until human activity finally drove it to extinction. The Yangtze River dolphin, the baiji, went extinct in 2006, a unique species, found nowhere else on Earth, gone, and we barely noticed. If something like that could disappear in the modern era, with all our science and documentation, imagine what could vanish in ancient times. A creature seen rarely, living in deep or remote waters, requiring specific conditions to survive. It could go extinct and leave almost no trace, just stories, just memories, just a name, dragon. And maybe that's all dragons ever were. Not gods, not myths, just animals. Rare, magnificent, and doomed. The last of their kind, glimpsed occasionally by fishermen and farmers, inspiring awe and fear and reverence. Until one day, there were no more. And all that remained was the story. Here's the uncomfortable possibility that no one wants to say out loud. What if dragons went extinct, not millions of years ago, like dinosaurs, but recently, historically recently, 2,000, 3,000 years ago? Still within the span of human memory, or at least human oral tradition. We know it's possible. The dodo went extinct in the 1600s. The thylacine in the 1930 seconds. The baiji in 2006. Extinction isn't some ancient event that only happened in prehistory. It's ongoing. And species can vanish quickly. Especially large animals that require specific habitats, have low reproductive rates, and come into conflict with humans. So let's imagine a scenario. Around 3000 BCE, there's an animal living in China's river systems. It's large, possibly the size of a crocodile or larger. It's rare, with a limited range, maybe restricted to certain tributaries of the Yangtze or isolated mountain lakes. It's semi-aquatic, spending time both in water and on land. And it has features that make it distinctive. Scales, claws, a long body, maybe sensory organs like whiskers or antler-like protrusions. The Neolithic people who encounter it are awed. It's dangerous, certainly, but also magnificent. They carve its image in jade. They tell stories about it. They treat it as sacred, a creature blessed by the heavens. Then civilization expands. Agriculture spreads. Rivers are dammed or diverted. Wetlands are drained. Forests are cleared. The creature's habitat shrinks. Sightings become rarer. By the time of the Shang Dynasty, around 1200 BCE, the animal is endangered. Scribes record it in oracle bones not because it's mythical, but because it's noteworthy, unusual, worth documenting when one is seen. Maybe a few are captured, kept by rulers as symbols of power. But the population is dwindling. By the Zhou Dynasty, 1000 BCE, it's functionally extinct. The last individuals die in isolated pockets. No one sees a living one anymore. But the memory persists. The carvings, the stories, the oracle bone inscriptions. Over the next 1,000 years, the creature shifts from animal to myth, from rare to impossible, from endangered species to dragon. This isn't wild speculation. We have cave paintings in China depicting animals that don't match any known species. We have ceremonial burials of strange bones, carefully arranged and honored. We have fossils from the Pleistocene era showing species that survived far longer in Asia than anywhere else. The pieces are there. What's missing is the final proof. A skeleton, complete and datable, that matches the descriptions in ancient texts. Or genetic material, preserved in sediment or ice, that could tell us what this creature was. Until we find that, the extinction theory remains just that. A theory, but it's one that fits the evidence better than most. Because it explains the consistency of dragon imagery. It explains the shift from observable creature to mythological being. And it explains why, despite thousands of years of searching, we haven't found dragons alive today, not because they never existed, but because they don't anymore. Modern science is starting to take the dragon question seriously. Not in the sense of hunting for living dragons, but in analyzing the descriptions, the artifacts, and the genetic record to understand what ancient people might have been observing. Paleogenetics, the study of ancient DNA, has made incredible advances in recent years. We can now extract and sequence genetic material from bones thousands of years old, reconstructing entire genomes of extinct species. And while no one has sequenced dragon DNA, obviously, researchers have been looking at the animals that might have inspired the myths, comparing their anatomy to dragon descriptions. Looking for overlap. One surprising discovery involves elongated vertebrae. Several extinct reptiles and aquatic animals had spinal structures that allowed for extreme flexibility, making them serpentine in movement despite having limbs. This matches Chinese dragon anatomy almost perfectly. Long body, 4 legs, capable of coiling. Another feature that keeps appearing is cranial structure. Some prehistoric reptiles had horn-like protrusions or crests on their skulls. Not true horns, but bony extensions that could easily be mistaken for antlers, especially in a partial skeleton or a quick sighting. And then there are the sensory organs. Catfish and other freshwater species have whisker-like barbels used to navigate murky water. If a large predatory fish or reptile had similar adaptations, an observer would describe it as having whiskers, which ancient Chinese descriptions consistently do. The overlap is too specific to ignore. Someone, somewhere, was observing real anatomical features. Whether from living animals, partial skeletons, or fossils, the details match too well to be pure invention. So here's the question researchers are asking now. Can we identify a specific species, living or extinct, that fits the dragon profile? Something with elongated vertebrae, cranial protrusions, sensory whiskers, scales, 4 limbs, and a semi-aquatic lifestyle. So far, no perfect match, but we're getting closer. And every new fossil discovery, every genetic analysis, brings us one step nearer to understanding what the ancient Chinese were really describing when they carved those jade dragons 7,000 years ago. There's a theory on the fringes of paleontology and anthropology, one that most academics won't touch publicly but that circulates in private conversations and late-night conference discussions. The theory is this: what if dragons weren't just animals? What if they were intelligent? Not human-level intelligence, not language or culture, but something more than pure instinct. The kind of intelligence we see in dolphins, elephants, or crows. Problem-solving, memory, social structure, maybe even limited communication with humans. Before you dismiss this as fantasy, consider the evidence. Chinese texts don't just describe dragons as animals. They describe them as beings, creatures capable of choice, of responding to human action, of behavior that suggests understanding. Some stories mention dragons that could be bargained with. Others describe dragons that seem to recognize specific people. There are accounts of dragons learning, adapting, even showing what looks like gratitude or revenge. Now, we know animals can do this. Elephants remember individuals for decades. Crows recognize human faces and teach their young to avoid specific people. Dolphins respond to human interaction in sophisticated ways. If dragons were large, long-lived reptiles or aquatic creatures, and if they had complex social structures, it's not impossible they'd display similar intelligence. And if ancient humans interacted with them regularly, they'd notice. They'd tell stories about the creature that remembered them, that responded to offerings, that seemed to understand. Over generations, those observations would become mythology. The intelligent animal becomes the wise dragon. The complex behavior becomes supernatural ability. But at the core, there might be truth. This theory explains something that's always puzzled researchers. Why are dragons so often described as benevolent, or at least neutral, rather than purely monstrous? Why do so many stories involve dragons helping humans, guiding them, teaching them? If dragons were just dangerous predators, the stories would all be about killing them. Instead, many are about coexisting with them. That suggests a relationship more complex than human versus beast. A relationship more like what we have with horses or dogs or elephants. Not domestication, necessarily, but understanding, mutual recognition, the kind of relationship that only develops when both sides have the capacity for it. Of course, this is speculative. We have no proof of dragon intelligence, but we also have no proof against it. And given how little we know about the creature the ancient Chinese were describing, it's worth keeping the possibility open. Because if dragons were intelligent, even partially, that changes everything. It means they weren't just animals the Chinese observed. They were beings the Chinese knew. And when they went extinct, it wasn't just a loss of biodiversity. It was the end of a relationship. A connection between species that had existed for thousands of years, until one side vanished and the other was left with only stories. Here's where history and politics intersect. By the time of the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE, dragons had become symbols of imperial power. The emperor's robes were embroidered with dragons. His throne was called the Dragon Throne. His face was the dragon face. To challenge the emperor was to challenge the dragon. This wasn't subtle metaphor. It was deliberate political messaging. The emperor is the dragon. The dragon is divine. Therefore, the emperor is divine. But here's the question. If dragons were purely fictional, why did this symbolism work? Why did people accept it without question? Lots of cultures invent symbols for power, eagles, lions, suns, but those are based on real animals or natural phenomena that people can see and verify. A lion is impressive because you can watch a real lion and see its strength. An eagle is majestic because you can see it fly. If dragons were pure myth, something no one had ever seen, would they carry the same weight? Or did the symbolism work precisely because people believed dragons had been real? That somewhere, in the past, dragons had existed. That their ancestors had seen them. That the emperor's claim to embody the dragon was a claim to ancient, primordial power. Power that predated writing. Power that stretched back to the very beginning of Chinese civilization. Later dynasties reinforced this connection obsessively. They didn't just adopt the dragon symbol. They made it exclusive. By the Ming and Qing dynasties, it was illegal for anyone but the emperor to wear 5-clawed dragon imagery. 4 claws were acceptable for nobility. But 5 claws belonged to the emperor alone. This level of control suggests the symbol meant something profound. Not just artistic tradition, but political theology. And if you dig into the reasoning, you find something interesting. The emperor wasn't claiming to be like a dragon. He was claiming to be the dragon's heir. The descendant of the Yellow Emperor who rode dragons. The keeper of a legacy that stretched back to when dragons walked the earth. That's not the language of metaphor. That's the language of lineage. Of inherited authority. Of connection to something real and ancient. And maybe that's why the symbol was so powerful. Because deep down, in cultural memory, people believed it. Not that dragons were gods, but that they had existed. That the past was stranger and more wondrous than the present. And that the emperor's power came from being connected to that lost mythical time when humans and dragons shared the world. So where are we now? In the 21st century, with all our technology and science, what have we learned about dragons? More than you'd think, and less than we need. Archaeological teams use LiDAR to scan ancient sites, looking for hidden structures or unusual features. In some areas, they found ceremonial platforms aligned to water sources, with carvings that might depict dragons or dragon-related rituals. Paleontologists continue to uncover fossils in China's rich sedimentary layers. Some of these fossils are bizarre. Species that don't fit neatly into known categories. Creatures with unusual body plans. Ambiguous adaptations. Things that might, just might, explain some of the dragon descriptions. Genetic researchers are analyzing ancient DNA from river sediments, hoping to find traces of extinct species. This is cutting-edge work, and it's yielding surprises. Species we didn't know existed. Animals that lived alongside humans and then vanished. None confirmed as dragons yet. But the door is open. There are also attempts to date the Hongshan jades more precisely. If we can determine exactly when those dragons were carved, and compare that to environmental and climatic data, we might be able to narrow down when and where the creature they depict could have lived. And there are scholars combing through ancient texts, looking for patterns and details that earlier translations missed, references to dragon behavior, habitat descriptions, seasonal patterns, anything that might give us a clue about what the ancient Chinese were really observing. But here's the frustrating part. For all this effort, we still don't have the smoking gun. No complete skeleton that matches the descriptions. No DNA sequence that solves the puzzle. No definitive proof that dragons were real animals, rather than cultural inventions. The evidence is suggestive. Compelling, even, but not conclusive, and that's where we're stuck. In the space between myth and memory, between legend and biology, knowing that something was there, recorded across thousands of years, carved in jade and written in bone, but unable, yet, to name it, to classify it, to confirm it. The search continues, in labs and libraries, in fossil beds and river sediments. And maybe, one day, someone will find the final piece, the evidence that bridges the gap and answers the question once and for all. Were dragons real? Until then, we're left with the mystery. And honestly, maybe that's fitting. Because some mysteries, even when solved, lose something in the solving. The dragon is powerful not just because of what it was, but because of what it represents. The unknown, the forgotten, the things we've lost and can barely remember. And maybe, in the end, that's enough. So, let's lay out the theories. 3 main interpretations, each with its own evidence, its own logic, and its own implications. First, the biological theory. Dragons were real animals. A species, probably reptilian or aquatic, that lived in ancient China and went extinct sometime between 3000 and 1000 BCE. The Hongshan jades are portraits. The oracle bone inscriptions are field observations. The myths are cultural memory, exaggerated over time but rooted in encounters with an actual creature. Evidence for this? The consistency of dragon imagery across time and geography. The anatomical specificity in descriptions. The shift from observational language in early texts to mythological reverence in later ones. The fossil record showing China had diverse megafauna, much of it now extinct. And the ecological plausibility of a large, semi-aquatic predator in ancient river systems. The weakness is the lack of definitive physical proof. No confirmed skeleton, no DNA, no remains that match beyond doubt. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially for a creature that might have gone extinct 4,000 years ago. Second, the composite theory. Dragons are mythical creatures built from observations of real animals. Snakes, crocodiles, fish, deer, all blended together into a symbolic being. The antlers come from stags, the scales from carp, the whiskers from catfish, the body from pythons. Ancient Chinese artists took pieces of their environment and assembled them into something greater. Evidence? The anatomical variety in dragon depictions. Some have wings, others don't. Some are more serpentine, others more reptilian. Regional variations suggest different animals inspired different features. This fits how mythologies typically develop, by combining familiar elements into extraordinary forms. The weakness is the early consistency. Hongshan dragons, carved before widespread cultural exchange, look remarkably similar across different sites. If dragons were composite inventions, you'd expect more experimentation, more variation in the earliest period. Instead, the opposite is true. Third, the cosmological theory. Dragons are spiritual beings, not biological ones. They represent natural forces, water, weather, seasonal cycles, given form and personality. They're embodiments of the natural world's power, meant to be understood metaphysically, not physically. Evidence? This is the traditional scholarly interpretation. It treats dragons as pure mythology, cultural creations meant to explain the inexplicable. It fits how other cultures use mythological beings to personify nature. And it explains why dragons never died out from the cultural consciousness. They were never alive in the biological sense to begin with. The weakness is the observational language in early texts. Oracle bones describe dragons the way they describe cattle and weather, as observable phenomena requiring documentation. That's not the language of spiritual metaphor. It's the language of natural history. So which theory is correct? The answer might be that they all are. In sequence, dragons could have started as real animals, rare and magnificent, observed and revered. As they went extinct, their memory blended with other creatures, becoming composite symbols enriched with features from pythons, fish, and deer. And eventually, as physical reality faded completely, they transformed into cosmological beings, representatives of forces rather than flesh. The biological becomes mythological, the real becomes symbolic. And we're left with fragments of each stage, layered over time, impossible to fully separate. The night is quiet now. Outside, the world sleeps. But somewhere in China, beneath mountains and rivers, in sediment and stone, the evidence waits. Maybe it's a fossil, perfectly preserved, lying in a cliff face no one has excavated yet. Maybe it's DNA, locked in ancient bones or trapped in permafrost, waiting for the right technique to extract it. Maybe it's an inscription, in a tomb or temple we haven't found, that describes the creature with enough detail to finally answer the question. Or maybe the evidence doesn't matter as much as we think it does. Because here's the thing about dragons. They refuse to die. For 7,000 years, humans have been trying to understand them, carving them, writing about them, studying them, and every generation reaches the same conclusion. There's something here, something real beneath the myth, something that demands attention. The ancient Chinese weren't fools. They weren't primitive people inventing fantasies to scare children. They were observers, survivors, people who knew their environment intimately because their lives depended on it. And when they carved a dragon into jade with painstaking precision, when they recorded dragon sightings in oracle bones alongside observations of weather and crops, when they tied their entire cultural identity to this creature, they were telling us something. Maybe they were recording an animal. Maybe they were preserving a memory. Maybe they were honoring something that had already vanished but deserved to be remembered. We'll probably never know for certain. The evidence might be too scattered, too degraded, too lost to time. But the question will persist. Because dragons aren't just a Chinese mystery. They're a human mystery. They appear in cultures around the world. Europe, the Middle East, Americas, Africa. Different forms, different names, but the same essential concept. A great serpent, a creature of power and mystery. Something that lived in the deep places, the old places, and inspired awe. If dragons were purely invented, why does every culture imagine them? But if they were real, why is there no definitive proof? That paradox is what makes them eternal. They exist in the space between known and unknown, between memory and imagination. And as long as we're curious, as long as we ask questions about the past, they'll endure. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about that. Think about the Hongshan jade, carved 6,700 years ago by hands that wanted to remember something. Think about the oracle bones, inscribed with matter-of-fact descriptions of creatures no one believes existed. Think about the Yangtze River, its depth still unexplored, its secrets still buried in sediment and time. Maybe the ancient Chinese were imagining dragons, creating myths to explain the world around them. But maybe, just maybe, they were remembering them. Remembering a time when the world was stranger, when humans shared the earth with creatures we can no longer name, when the rivers held more than fish, when the sky was wider, when the boundary between possible and impossible wasn't quite so fixed. Maybe dragons were real. And maybe, in the only way that truly matters, they still are. Because a story repeated for 7,000 years becomes its own kind of truth. Not scientific truth. Not the kind you can weigh or measure or sequence. But the truth of memory. Of wonder. Of the persistent, aching sense that we've lost something we can't quite name. Something magnificent. Something that, once, made the world feel bigger. The dragon is that something. And whether it lived in flesh or in imagination, it lives still, in jade. In oracle bones. In myths and carvings and stories told in the dark. It lives in the question itself. Were dragons real? And the answer? The only answer that matters, is this. They were real enough to be remembered. Real enough to endure. Real enough that tonight, 7,000 years later, we're still wondering, still searching, still trying to understand. Sleep well. And maybe, in your dreams, you'll see them, coiling through rivers, rearing from lakes, serpentine, and strange and impossibly alive. The dragons that once were. The dragons that might have been. The dragons that, in the end, refuse to be forgotten.